Welcome into the Autzen Audibles podcast. I'm Matt Prehm, Eric Scopel on the show, and Steve Bartle of UteZone is coming on the pod to break down this Oregon-Utah matchup. Probably one of the biggest games that the league was anticipating at the start of the season. When you map out the schedule and you look at the big ones, there's always the rivalry games, and then there's this one. This is one of the always the better games of the season, conference wide. Two of the better teams in the conference the last couple of seasons, and excited to get to preview this one. Steve will be in Eugene covering this one for UteZone, so make sure to check out his coverage there. Steve, let's talk big picture first for Utah. Outsider's perspective, this is maybe the first year preseason wise that there were national expectations that the Utes would be a playoff contender, that they would be a conference preseason favorite. Obviously, there's a lot of people in Salt Lake City that every year going in thinking, hey, this is the year we could win the league, that we should win the league. We have the talent. But that noise came from outside the program in a large way. Preseason picks for the playoffs even. How has this season gone from a Utah fan's perspective with those national expectations? Not only are the fans saying, hey, this should have been a playoff team going into the year, that was kind of the expectation from a lot of national media members too. Is this 8-2? You're at the end of November. You're in the playoff hunt. You're in the Pac-12 championship hunt. You win on Saturday. You're in. Is this still viewed as a really good year, or is maybe those expectations maybe dampened things just a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that with the expectations coming into the season, right, you have a team that won the conference championship last year and you return most of that roster, right? Expectations are going to be a lot higher than they are normally. And I think with the way that the season has played out, with a tough loss at Florida that ultimately came down to the final possession, the final seconds in that game, and then a surprising loss to UCLA on the road, and especially in the manner in which it came, I think it's certainly, it's certainly put a little bit of a damper on the season compared to expectations. This was a program that, talked about repeating as Pac-12 champions, but also, competing for more than just the conference championship. The goal is always to win the conference, but, they had their eyes on, bigger goals. And, some of those goals are still very much attainable. Getting back to the Rose Bowl is something that this team is, certainly focused on as well. But, the college football playoff was certainly, when you're in the top 10 preseason, that's on the radar, and you can't deny it. You can't hide from it. You got to embrace those expectations. And, the Florida loss was interesting because I feel like they went into that game and, competed and showed really well. Again, Florida Gators have not lost a home opener for quite some time. It's a tough place to play. And they took it down to the wire. And yet that UCLA loss, I think, is where kind of things started to dampen a little bit, just because, again, of how that loss came and that. So, compared to where we were preseason, like, I do think things have dampened a bit, but still, you're right there mid-November. You're ranked number 10 in the country. Like, that's tough to be super disappointed about.
To this series, in a broad sense, Steve, we were just had a podcast discussion a couple weeks ago about Oregon Utah as a rivalry, and we were actually kind of split about how do you define it? Is it a rivalry in terms of just because of what the goals are and competing for those goals? Obviously, Oregon Utah have been in conference championship games, played head to head for some of them recently. Is it a rivalry that has some of the malice you might see of I'm not sure exactly how you want to define that, but like Oregon, Washington comes to town, there's a certain level of vitriol between those programs that's just kind of understood, and it makes it easy to define as a rivalry. How is this game, which is becoming kind of I think a fun annual tradition, felt in Salt Lake City? Is Oregon seen as a rival? What is kind of the perception of this game every year right now from you guys' perspective?
Yeah, that's been a a discussion a little bit as well with this Oregon matchup. It's certainly one that, you look back, you go back to 2019, both teams have been ranked in each of the last 4 matchups, right? So this year you've got a number 10 Utah, number 12 Oregon, the championship game last year, and then number 3, number 23 at Utah. You go back to 2019 in the Pac-12 title game as well, number 5 Utah, number 13 Oregon in that one. So, the last 4 matchups alone, we're talking about top 15, top 25 programs in every matchup. And I think that says a lot. And I think that really has kind of raised the stakes for this Utah-Oregon rivalry, quotation marks, I guess, if we want to call it that. I certainly think the competition and what these two programs are competing for on a regular basis over the last 4 years has certainly made it more of a rivalry. It's never going to be, it's never going to be Oregon, Washington. It's never going to be Utah, BYU. There's just that emotional factor that I don't think Utah and Oregon will ever attain. But look, these programs, it's more than just these top 25 matchups. These programs compete for a lot of the same recruits. Oregon's won quite a bit of them. Utah's won, a handful here and there as well. And so it's that as well contributes to kind of the rivalry. You're just competing so much. There's just so much competition between these two programs that I think it's I don't want to say it's silly to not call it a rivalry, but I think you're justified in calling it that.
Yeah, I was the one in that discussion on our podcast that didn't think it was a rivalry. I called it more of a mutual respect that, hey, like, sure, they're good, we're good, type of a deal. Now, that being said, hearing what a couple of offensive players said about this game today, I definitely feel like there's now definitely some more anger or dislike towards Utah based off of what happened. I mean, the way Chris Hudson talked, really looking forward to the matchup against Clark Phillips, and we'll get to him later. And Dante Thornton said the same thing. Now, defensive players, they seem to be just kind of like, yeah, like, we're not really worried about it. Like, they're good. We're good. We'll figure it out. I'm going off script here, Eric. I'm changing my question that I had for Bartle here. Only because I saw this come out on Twitter just now. Tom Fornelli of CBS released his college football QB power rankings. And Cam Rising's not on the list. Kind of surprising to me. Just what's his season been like? I mean, I guess just from a live reaction, he's really good. And I think going into the year, he was preseason number 1. Caleb Williams, I think, was preseason number 2. And there really wasn't any kind of whoa, that's wrong. Like, Cam Rising, proved he was very good last season, was the league's top quarterback coming in. Just what's been his season like this season, where there was so much expected of him and of this Utah offense?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think, from an outsider's perspective, you can look at the numbers and not come away super impressed with what Cam has done, right? You look at, especially over the last 2 weeks against Stanford and Arizona, 2 defenses that, will basically give you whatever you want on offense, whether it be through the air or on the ground. And Cam didn't necessarily perform super efficiently in those games. And the thing to consider with Cam is against USC, he suffered a bit of an injury. It is an injury. And so he missed the Washington State game, which I'm sure everybody saw that in the Pac-12, just the snafu with Fox Sports and Peter Papadopoulos, or however you say his name, and just kind of what happened there with Cam, essentially saying that at game time, literally 20 minutes before a game, that he didn't feel comfortable. He didn't feel like he was going to be able to play at his best. And so, the injury has certainly been a factor for him, or it feels like has been a factor for him in his play over the last 2 weeks. But overall, when you look at what Cam has done and you go back to that USC matchup, 415 yards through the air, was very good, a very efficient passer in that matchup. And the thing with Cam is, you know, he has the experience, but he's so smart. He has a great football IQ, his ability to read defenses, and also so his ability to read defenses, understand what he's looking at, and get Utah in the right plays is such an important thing for any quarterback, but especially Utah, where you rely so much on the run game and you want to be in the most advantageous situations as you can be. And Cam has a good understanding of what they're trying to do on offense. So he's able to read defenses, get him into the right plays. But more than that is he's also able to communicate what he's seeing on from the defense. And he's able to communicate that with offensive coordinator Andy Ludwig, who then can benefit from that as well. So, you know, Cam's ability to make good decisions and help his offensive coordinator also make good decisions is a valuable trait that just you'll never be able to quantify that. You'll never be able to see that on a box score, on a stat sheet, but it's certainly a factor for this Utah team. And, you know, he's played really well in Utah's biggest games. You know, he's come up big. He threw the interception against Florida on the final possession, but without Cam Rising, Utah is never in that position in the final seconds in the red zone. He drove them the length of the field in less than a minute 25, I think is what it was. I think a minute 34, actually. So a minute 34 drives the length of the field and gets them into scoring position. And, you know, so he's played his best football in a lot of Utah's biggest games. It's just unfortunate the injury has kind of cost him the last 2 weeks where he hasn't been able to pad the stats a little bit. But, you know, he's still a very dangerous very good quarterback.
Petros Papadakis?
Yes.
I think.
Yes.
And we've also mispronounced that name on this podcast. So I'm just trying to give it our best shot.
Yeah.
For Mr. Petros, in case he's listening.
Yep.
No, actually, I'm going to change script because why not? It's a podcast. That's what we do. I'll tie into the question I was going to ask, but that whole exchange with Fox Sports and Utah over that was one of the stupidest things I've ever seen.
Yes.
Like, so why does the TV guys think that they get to know everything? What are you doing? And like, it's also, there's a level of irony this week because Oregon goes into it completely shutting down practice access from an injury perspective. So I think it's kind of timely to bring it up because like at a certain point, there's no NCAA regulation or rule in place that says anything has to be said about anything injuries. And yet we have a lot of, I'm kind of going to rant for a moment, Steve, because we've got people on our site really bitching at us
away.
for not disclosing the injury information we have. When if I were to disclose that on like this podcast or on the board, it would help Utah. Just like if Kyle Whittingham had told Fox Sports, like, yeah, maybe he won't go, if even knew that information, which it didn't seem like they really did, like that would have helped Washington State. So like, I just feel like people think they're owed a lot more information with injury reports. So you mentioned it. And so I thought I'd just bring that up because it's kind of ironic how that sort of comes to think. So like this week, you probably don't know, Steve, like there's some injuries that Oregon's dealing with. And Dan basically is like, yeah, you guys can watch practice, but you can't write about anything from injury perspective, which is new. So we're kind of dealing with that our own.
It's so tough because like you've got to maintain that relationship, right? Like you don't want to lose your credential. Like that's tough, dude. So that's a tough spot to be in. Well,
and so let me ask you an injury question because I know Kyle Whittingham is not notoriously great with dealing with injury information. What is like the overall state of the Utes from a health perspective? I know Van Fillinger is like out for this. That's like he's not coming back.
Yeah.
When they played in Pullman, it wasn't just. I know that was about 3 weeks ago. It wasn't just Rising that was injured. Tavian Thomas didn't make the trip. Dalton Kincaid was hurt. But based upon what took place against Stanford last week and even the game before, it seems like those guys are back and close to full like strength. Does this feel like a Utah team that is pretty darn healthy? And I ask in part because this is an Oregon team where it doesn't feel like that right now.
Yeah, you know, I feel like Utah was where Oregon is this week, you know, a couple weeks ago, right? Against that Washington State team, like this Utah team was, you know, I mean, it felt like things were held together by duct tape. literally health-wise. Like that's just where this team, it felt like it was at. But the last 2 weeks have been really good from a health perspective where, you know, guys have been able to get time away, get a lot of recovery. And coming into this matchup, Utah is, as they're in as good a shape as they could hope to be. Obviously, the loss of Van Fillinger is a tough blow, and that was a surprising one because it didn't happen in a game. It happened in practice, actually. So that was a fairly decent surprise. Brant Keithy is the only other season-ending injury that Utah has suffered, knock on wood. And so, you know, this team coming into Eugene, it's as healthy as, you know, you could hope. There are some injuries that they're dealing with, nothing major, but for the most part, this team has taken advantage of the last 2 weeks and gotten pretty healthy.
Tavion Thomas, running back. I asked Dan Lanning today, like, have they faced a player from a physical standpoint similar? He said, not really. I mean, he's like 6'2", 240 pounds, essentially. Really big dude. Power running back. I think Dan called him like, this is one where like you're going to get put on your back tackling him a couple times. He's had an up and down season though. Really good last year. But hey, last week against Stanford's always a good medicine pill for teams in the conference this season. He went for 180 and 2 tutties. What's just been his season like? And we always know Utah loves to run the football. And is that the case still with Tavion, or has Cam Rising's, you know, return kind of opened things up a little bit more, and maybe that plays a factor into him not being as productive?
Yeah, with Tavion, it's been a season. Let's say that. It's been a season. It's for him, there's off the field context to consider in the fact that he lost essentially his mother, the mother figure in his life early in the season. I believe it was his grandmother or aunt that took him in as a child and basically raised him, passed away in September. And so there was just a lot to come from that he had to battle through. And so there were a few weeks where he played a limited amount. And it essentially all kind of stems from that whole situation. There were, and so he's had the last couple weeks away from the program, and it's been really good for him. He talked about it this week in our media availability, is that, you know, he really needed some time away to kind of figure things out and to kind of learn the value of being on a team like Utah and seeing how important everybody is, and seeing how important having that team behind him really matters to him. And so really good to hear that from him, just considering what he's went through this season. And like you said, Matt, that Stanford team is very much a nice little spoonful of medicine for ailing offenses and defenses. And so, you know, Tavion got going a little bit, 180 yards, and he looked good. He looked as explosive as he has in his time at Utah. He looked really good, and he's still 240 pounds, and you wouldn't know it by watching him last week against Stanford. So, you know, he's kind of rounding into form, and that's a good thing for Utah, because this is still a team that, you know, they personify the famous Marshawn Lynch quote of just going to run it over and over and over and over and over again. Like, that's Utah wants to run it through a MFer's face. Like, that's just who they are. They want to be that. They're a program. Their brand is built on toughness, and there is nothing tougher than running right through you. And that's just who they are. Kyle Whittingham loves that. And that's always going to be the point of emphasis at Utah, is just running it and running it a lot. However, Cam Rising has shown this season that he can do things with the ball in his hands. If Utah wants to open things up and throw the ball around, they've got the playmakers around him. They've got the protection, which hasn't always been the case over the last couple of years, especially in this Oregon matchup. They've got the protection and feel good like they can protect him. And if they need to open things up, they can do so and throw the ball around a little bit as well.
Are we going to take a break, Matt, or I guess I thought we were taking a break right there. But I'll ask a question if not.
Yeah, I was going to let you ask the question, and then I was going to go to break.
All right, well, let's ask the question, and then we'll go to break. Great podcasting. I think another thing, Steve, that when you look at this Utah team and kind of what it's known for, you mentioned the run game, but the other part has been defensively playing really sound and not giving up big plays and keeping things in front of you, and a level of tenacity that I think is sort of distinguishes the Utes from a lot of teams that you see in this conference. There was quite a bit of turnover for Utah this offseason. And I guess I'm wondering, because now you look up at the conference stats and they're right where they usually are, right at the top in scoring defense, right at the top in total defense, right at the top in pass coverage defense. What was there a point where it clicked? Was there a point where things started coming together, and kind of, is there an explanation for why that took place? Is it just a matter of time elapsing and providing that, or is there was there some kind of light bulb moment that took place?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both, Eric. I think over the course of the season, this defense, certain individuals have just gotten better with time and with more time on the field. There are certain individuals like a defensive tackle, Samote Pepa. There's a defensive end, Jonah Ellis. These two have just gotten better with the more they've played. And that's just kind of that's been a benefit. But I do think there was a moment where things really kind of turned for this Utah defense. And it was actually the second half of that USC game. How can you be proud of a 42-point performance where you give up 42 points to USC, but that's USC, and you limited them to, I think, less than 170 yards in that second half, which that's okay. You'll live with that against USC, right? So there was a moment in that, not a moment, but that second half is really where things started to kind of click. They figured out some adjustments, how they needed to play, particularly in the secondary in that game. But then the bye week came after that. And I feel like that was really kind of what has allowed the defense to kind of refine its footing, rediscover itself. And it obviously helps when you play, Washington State, Arizona, and Stanford. We talked about Stanford being the medicine to fix all, but Arizona, with the weather that played there, that was a tough test. Jaden Delore is kind of a wild card, kind of a gambler. He is the definition of a gambling man. But then Washington State was just, Utah matched up really well with them. So you've had these three games that have also just kind of coincided with the defensive performance and has really kind of allowed Utah to rediscover themselves, but also kind of regain their confidence. And I feel like that was kind of the missing element with the team early on in the early weeks for specifically this defense. Now they have a better understanding of the defensive scheme, and they're playing with more confidence than they were early on as well.
All right, now we'll take the quick break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Steve Bartle. All right, welcome back to the Autzen podcast. Steve, Clark Phillips, one of, if not the best cornerback in the Pac-12. How much do you anticipate him matching up one-on-one with one specific receiver, which I would assume if they do that would be Troy Franklin? Yeah. Or do they like to move him around? And just kind of what's just been your perspective of his impact week to week against teams' best receivers and just his impact there?
Yeah, no, this is a matchup that I'm super interested in because, while Clark Phillips is obviously one of the best cornerbacks in the conference, Troy Franklin is also one of the best receivers. Like, what he's done this season has been really, really impressive. I actually talked to Clark specifically about Troy Franklin, and he mentioned, his height, his length gives him a huge catch radius. And for cornerbacks, that can be tough to battle. And so, it's going to be important for Clark to be physical against Troy when they are matched up. And the thing that Utah has really benefited from is that Clark is very comfortable all over the field. You can put him outside. You can put him on the opponent's best receiver. You can put him in the slot, which is a very different position from outside corner, right? You've got the ability. You have to be able to defend both ways. And that's something that you can utilize the sideline for leverage on the outside, which he does a very good job of. So having a cornerback, having a defender like Clark that can match up and play all over the field is really a weapon that Utah does a good job of utilizing. And I don't necessarily think that Clark is going to follow Troy around throughout the entirety of the game, but I do think we'll see a good amount of matchups between those two because, frankly, Franklin is that good and he demands, a lot of attention from Utah. And so that's going to be a very important matchup for the Utes to at least slow down Franklin. You can't eliminate a talent like him, but you can certainly, make it tough for him and make him earn it at the very least.
The pressure numbers have changed a lot the last month for Utah in terms of getting home. You look at the game with Florida, no sacks, even against Oregon State, I should say, no sacks. But the last, I think, four more sacks 3 times, 7 against Stanford, and we've talked about Stanford and kind of what that is and what that isn't, which is a very, very, very not a very good football team. But what's led to the manufacturing of pressure? And I ask in part because one of the things Dan spoke with, I think, pretty effusive praise with Kyle Whittingham was the way that defensive staff is able to, drum up pressures, bring things that are exotic. I think he said that they have one of the highest pressure rates in the country in terms of bringing more than 5 players. What is it about this Utah defense? Are they doing anything differently, or is it just more of the same? And again, as we said earlier, it took a little time for maybe some of the players in new roles to kind of assimilate and get comfortable with what they were doing.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier Samote Pepa being an important development, but Jonah Ellis, the defensive end, his progress has also been really, really beneficial for this team. And he's been kind of the biggest difference for Utah in their ability to generate pressure. But really what it is that Utah's doing better on first and second downs and getting teams into longer conversion situations, which obviously tends to lead to pass opportunities, passing downs, where you can kind of just pin your ears back and get after the quarterback. And so that's been the most important thing, is that Utah is defending better on first and second downs. And again, it starts with the interior of the line with Junior Tafuna, Aliki Vamahi, and Samote Pepa at that defensive tackle positions. They're limiting the run and setting up longer conversion down situations. So that is really kind of the biggest difference from what we saw early on in the year, where Utah was really struggling defending the run. They didn't have the opportunities to pin their ears back and just get after the quarterback. So that is kind of the biggest factor. But as you mentioned, Eric, Utah is a defense where they've got some athletes behind the defensive line at linebacker and at safety that they love to utilize getting after the quarterback. Mahmoud Diabate, the Florida Gator transfer, he's a very dynamic athlete at 6'3", 227 pounds. He can't necessarily play defensive end full time, but he's a guy that's very adept, very good at getting to the quarterback in a hurry. And so you want to utilize that. Lander Barton is duly capable of playing linebacker and defensive end. Similarly, you're going to send him on a number of pressures. You want him attacking the line of scrimmage. And then, Utah loves to mix things up and bring some exotic things with safety and cornerback blitzes as well. So, Morgan Scalley is, he's never afraid to dial up a blitz. And that's certainly been the case over the last few weeks. But it all starts with being better on first and second downs, which comes back to the play of the interior of the defensive line. and just kind of speaks to the progress of the unit as a whole.
What's my last question for you, Steve, is just maybe like, is there an area or a position group or a player that you feel like Oregon has an advantage coming in? Like, from a perspective to flip it, like I'm terrified to see how Oregon covers Utah's tight ends. Like,
yeah,
Oregon cannot cover across the middle. Their linebackers are not good in pass coverage. They're very good against the run, but they are terrible against the pass. Is there that type of a scenario for Utah in this game?
Yeah, again, I come back to I'm praising the defensive line for the progress that they've made, but still, that's my biggest concern coming into this game, because that Oregon offensive line is very physical, especially at the tackle positions. And that's kind of where I'm most concerned. I'm watching, the Washington game. I'm watching past games. The power and counter run plays that Oregon likes to run, where you can get TJ Bass and the right tackles. How do you say his name?
Big Sala. Just call him Big Sala, Steve.
Big Sala. I love it. Big Sala. You can get them down blocking, and they're guys that can move defensive ends and defensive tackles. Like, they're very physical. And that kind of, for me, that's a worry, especially considering the fact that, Van Fillinger is not available. He would have been great in this match. I shouldn't say I don't want to say he would have been performed great, but I feel he's the type of player that Utah needs in this matchup. And the fact that he's not available kind of leaves me concerned, just because he was that type of physical defensive end that could match the physicality of these offensive tackles and offensive line in general. So for me, while I've praised the progress of the offensive line, it's still kind of like they need to prove it. They need to validate the progress that they've shown over the last couple of weeks. This is a big test for them, and they have the opportunity to pass the test or fail the test. And this, you go back to the two losses that they've suffered this year against UCLA and Florida, and it's been the run game that has cost Utah, and defending the run game that has cost Utah. And so that is where my biggest concern is, because of how good that Oregon offensive line is. It's a very physical front, and they've got good running backs that complement that offensive line really, really well.
I'm going to try to pronounce it for real, though. I think it's Malasala Amavai Laulu.
I'm very good with Polynesian names for the most part, but that one I'm not touching.
You know who wasn't good at Polynesian names was Mario Cristobal, who I think just decided he couldn't pronounce Malasala's first name, so he just called him Big Sala. So that was all everybody called him Sala since he got
Big
here.
Sala.
Four letters was a lot easier than 13 for
yeah.
Okay, last one I've got, and then we'll wrap. This is pretty just basic stuff. I think we ask every guest, but just what are three things the Utes need to do to win this game? What are three keys? And you kind of established, I think, one of them. You've probably said what all three of them are throughout this podcast, because it's been pretty in depth, but just to kind of encapsulate it, what are the things you'd be kind of watching for?
Yeah, again, first and foremost, defending the run. You've got to be able to defend the run and make this Oregon offense one-dimensional. Bo Nix stuff aside, his availability is obviously going to be a big factor in this game. But for Utah, you have to control what you can control, and defending the run is at the top of the board for me. Next, I think you have to establish the passing game against this Oregon Duck defense. And a big factor in that, Matt, you brought him up, Dalton Kincaid. You go back to that USC game, 16 for 16 receptions on targets, 234 yards, 1 touchdown. He was the guy that was really, really difficult for USC and their athletes to defend. So you're kind of hoping that, not necessarily a repeat performance, but he needs to be a factor in this game. And the good thing is for Utah in the passing attack is that Devon Vele, wide receiver on the outside at 6'5", has emerged as a go-to receiver for Cam as well. And then they've got other complementary players in the passing game as well that, if Utah does want to spread it out and throw it around, they can utilize them. So, Money Parks, Solomon Enos, Mekhi Cope. These are guys that Utah can utilize in the passing game as well. So you have to be able to make the passing game, but make Oregon pay for their secondary, their defensive secondary, and some of the poor play there. But you have to, I shouldn't say poor play, but just the space that'll be there with the secondary. So you got to take advantage of that. And then, you've got to make life difficult for Bo Nix if he plays, right? Like this, I'm heaping praise on this Oregon offensive line because it's so damn good. They've protected Bo Nix tremendously, and it's allowed Bo Nix to change the entire narrative around his career, right? Like Bo Nix at Auburn is nothing. Like it's nothing of Bo Nix at Oregon. Like it's night and day difference. And so while Bo Nix has been the biggest difference this year, the key to that has been the offensive line and their ability to protect him. So you've got to make it difficult, and that's going to be tough against this Oregon offensive line. So, but still, those are kind of my three keys. You got to stop the run, or at least make it tough, and then you've got to take advantage of opportunities through the air, and then make life difficult for Bo Nix.
Well, Steve, thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. Should be a really good game, 3-point spread. Yes. Hopefully we get that type of a performance. Neither of these games the last two times have been close. I'm sure Utah fans would love a third straight of that nature. Oregon fans hoping for something different, but nonetheless, hopefully we get a good game to cover in Autzen Stadium. We'll see you in the press box. Thank you for coming on the show. We'll talk to you down the road.